All right, well, hey guys, here's your video on First Thessalonians chapter 3. Again, a fun section of this book, but honestly, pretty similar to the section we just read. And so if there was ever a week to go back over the OIAP method, this would be it. Reminding the guys, hey, this is what we do. We make observations, and then together we discuss those observations, and as a group make interpretations based on them, apply those interpretations, and figure out ways that we can practice them together. And so I would spend a little bit of time just reminding them the framework for this semester. We're doing inductive Bible study. And if you haven't yet begun to do this and have just discussed, this might be a great week to start. Have them write out their lists, their observations, and then their interpretations. Rewrite the section together so that they can have an understanding and then apply and practice it. For those groups who have done this, there has been huge success. So a great week to get back to the basics and really reiterate, hey, this is the method which we're studying. You can see what I've got down here. You have a lot of lists, 3 lists that kind of take place, one of which is Timothy being called the brother and God's co-worker. I put that down in questions too, just asking why is it that Paul uses brother and co-worker of God to describe who Timothy is. Establish and exhort, faith and love. Vain is repeated, not necessarily just in this section, but as you read the previous parts of this letter too, Paul talking about the word being preached in vain or not in vain, it is repeated everywhere. There's some contrasts that exist that would be great to talk about, what it means to labor in vain versus not laboring in vain. And then even some things that really stick out. This idea that Paul knew suffering was coming. And that is, if you guys talk about anything this week, it would be about the idea of Christians and suffering and what that means, and that Paul is willing to say, hey, before you even accepted our gospel, we told you that in doing so, you would face suffering. There's comfort in distress, which is an amazing idea in this idea that we see where he says, for now we live. So some really cool things that stick out that you could talk about. I bet the boys will point those out. And then there's lots of explanations that take place. And so you see therefore a lot, that no one would be moved, and then fors that take place everywhere, kind of explaining. So again, some observations that I made. You can make your own interpretations based on them, but do this as a group. Observe together and interpret together. What I do want to do is just point out a few questions that might be worth talking about this week. And this is a little different than I normally do it, but I think it's worth kind of discussing some of these. And so the first, or the idea comes from, hey, let's try and put ourselves in the shoes of everyone in this section. And within this section, we have Timothy, we have Paul, and the Thessalonian believers. And so when we put ourselves in the shoes of Timothy, we would ask, how can we be Timothys who relay good news? Timothy went and visited the church in Thessalonica and came back with the good news that they were being steadfast in their faith. How can we also be people who relay good news? Now, that doesn't mean we need to make up fake good news. It doesn't mean we need to only focus on the positive and not see what can be improved. But there definitely were things that Timothy brings back that weren't good news. And we'll see that later in this book and even in 2 Thessalonians. But I think it is important for us to ask ourselves, what's the good news that we can relay today? Because that stuff is contagious. And I think joy is a huge sign of a believer. And so how can we be people who relay good news? Just a question to ask. The next would be, how can we be Pauls who are assured by the good news of faith in others? And so in this section, we see Paul talks about how he was reassured by the report that Timothy gave of the Thessalonians' faith. And it would have been really easy for Paul to hear that the Thessalonians are doing well and trusting in the Lord, and then immediately say, yeah, but what about this? And begin to ask questions and worry in different ways. But what we see happen is Paul hears that the Thessalonians were doing well. He trusts that they're doing well, and he begins to take steps forward in writing them, but believing them. We hear good news. Hey, so-and-so got a good report on their CT scan, and yet we still choose to worry. We hear that such and such happened at school, and so this might be the consequence, and we worry. A lot of times we're given good news, and yet we still respond and worry. What would it look like to be similar to Paul, hear good news, and respond in faithfulness and rejoicing? And then how can we be like the Thessalonians, who propagated or put forth the good news of steadfastness, even in tough circumstances? The Thessalonian believers were sending forth a report that was of good news and of their faithfulness. How can we be people who do that? Again, I realize we won't always have good news, so we don't need to be like Timothy all the time, spreading just good news. But when we do get that good report, how can we be similar to Timothy here? How can we be like Paul, who is assured by good news that we receive? And how can we be like the Thessalonians, who propagate that good news of steadfastness? Ross Washburn, I was meeting with him, and he said this last thing. He said, as I read this section, it sounds like Paul's really saying, hey, we were built for this stuff, talking about suffering. We knew it was coming. So I think he's on to something. Paul is making it pretty clear. Hey, to be a believer, to be like Christ, is to suffer like Christ. And that shouldn't get us down, but it actually should help motivate us, knowing that Jesus walks with us even in those circumstances. My application, and you guys can figure out how you might apply this or practice it, would be, let's be people who cling to community in the midst of afflictions. We know suffering's coming. We know hardship will endure. And so let's be people who then run to community rather than to unhealthy coping mechanisms in the midst of those hard times. A little shorter video today, but get back to the basics of observing, interpreting, applying, and practicing. And let me know if you guys have any questions. Thanks.